semester of first year, through the first semester of first year Hindi and then the second semester of first year Hindi, how you could have these conversations right from the start. You do not have to wait. I also want to add that Hindi language, when it is taught, you also teach the script. So a lot of the time in the first semester is dedicated to script. So that also takes away time when it could have been utilized, for instance, in vocab instruction or grammar. So I want to also acknowledge that there would also be those differences in Hindi language teaching, or a language that does not have a Roman writing system. They might have those experiences also. So I also just wanted to, in the beginning, clearly establish who we are referring to as less commonly taught languages. So there are about 78 of them that are identified by the Higher Education Act. And I've included the ones that are also taught at the Center for Languages at RISE. So we have Arabic, Chinese, we used to have Hindi, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, Russian. All of these languages at the center would classify as less commonly taught languages. Also, not all less commonly taught languages, like all language programs, are not the same. Some of these things would apply to some less commonly taught languages versus others. So they tend to be smaller programs than other conventionally larger programs in the US, for instance, Spanish, or even Italian or German. And these, a lot of less commonly taught languages have programs that have lower enrollments. So a lot of the time that instructors spend teaching is also concerned with other aspects that are sometimes not directly related to teaching. So they might be struggling with just sustaining themselves. They might have fewer opportunities for collaboration. They might be teaching in really isolated programs. And one of the things that I struggled a lot, especially in the beginning, was there were less readily available high quality materials. It is not that you would not have curriculum materials, but they would not be what I would consider at that time, at least, high quality. I also want to say that especially if you are beginning to teach in the US and you do not have a community of language instructors, so for instance, South Asian Language Teachers Association is not very active, was not very active when I started. So you would not know until much, much later. It took me 2 years to find other people who were also teaching South Asian languages, and then eventually build that network. So a lot of times, instructors in less commonly taught languages might also struggle on their own or try to figure out their path on their own. I will just include a note about curriculum materials in Hindi and Urdu, because I'm going to be talking about them. So these are some highly popular materials right now. These are not exhaustive, but these are the ones that are used. So at the bottom are the textbooks. As you would see, I can zoom in maybe. So as you would see at the bottom, these textbooks, they're generally black and white. And these are the things I'm talking about when I'm saying illustrations, right? When you say high quality materials, all of these publications require funding, right? They require publishing houses to be interested in producing this work with better quality, hiring better illustrators. So you have all of that component also, in addition to content knowledge in the language, developing the language. So these two, for instance, and these are 2000s publications in the year 2000s, and you would have these black and white images. It is only recently that you would start seeing images that are more colored, that are more representative, that are more attractive to learners to want to engage with these materials. We're not even discussing content right now. We're just discussing basic illustrations, right? A lot of these tend to be grammar heavy. So they you would have one image in a chapter, and then everything else would be dialogue, or there would be just worksheets as translation exercises. A lot of times just a vocab list, not a lot of opportunities also for vocab review, etc. And then you would have, when you have money invested, so for instance, through startup programs, then you can create more elaborate audiovisual resources. So all of this to say that, let's see, I can go back. All of this to say that creation of high quality materials requires money, requires investment that is sometimes not available to less commonly taught languages. I also want to say that I'm not suggesting by talking about curriculum materials in any language that I'm looking for a perfect textbook. We know that there is never going to be a perfect textbook. No matter how much reflection you do, you have to constantly, as you learn more, as you grow more, you learn to hopefully identify that there is more work to do. So there's not going to be a perfect textbook, but some textbooks do require more reflection and more work than others. I'll also talk a little bit about my journey because I think it helps to see, sometimes it at least helped me to see when others talked about it, how they reached where they are or how they began thinking about the materials in the way they are right now. Because if we only look at the outcome, like we do with our students, if you only look at the outcome, we do not realize how much work might go or how one might approach creation of something that they found is inspirational, for instance. So I would say that my work in social justice informed pedagogy, or even thinking about diversity or inclusion in my educational efforts, did not start until 2018, actually. 2018 is how recent it was. That was my first introduction to social justice informed language pedagogy. And I remember the exact moment. I was attending this presentation for a German language class, first year German language class, and they were talking about family. And I realized as I watched the presentation, oh my God, my family is just a heteronormative, upper middle class Hindu family living in an urban area in India. And that was all examples of family that I could think of. And that moment, I think that shock really shook me and really made me investigate what is it that I am doing in my classrooms. I have so much power as an instructor in what I present to the learners and teach them to value and see this is the culture. Like that was the moment that really stands out to me in my journey for social justice informed language pedagogy that really, I think, initiated this chain of events where I would want to critically examine what is it that I'm presenting to my students. The second, I think, the point was the year 2020, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But before I talk about that, I also want to say, so after I had attended the presentation, I could not immediately begin to bring about change, but I started what I think Ujjuane also talks about in her presentations, that you don't have to immediately go for far-reaching impacts. You could start small, right? What is something small that I could do today? What is something small that maybe I could do in the next unit? So a few of the things that I became really aware of and I started incorporating almost immediately was in the following semester was, for instance, when you talk about adjectives in Hindi and you have certain adjectives that are so focused on physical complexion, right? Or you have, there's an English word sweet that we use to describe people, but that word in Hindi is homophobic. You would not use that word to describe somebody in Hindi. So I started having those conversations with my students in the following semester, spring 2019. But I have to admit, this is where I started. So 2020 really, I think, shook me and really made me question, what is it that I'm doing? There was a lot going on in the year 2020. There was the pandemic, of course, and there was a crisis, a larger crisis, whether that was health-wise or economically or sociopolitically in the US, in India, and I think also the rest of the world. There was a lot of unrest that was going. And the two questions that I really thought about as I was navigating that along with the rest of the world was, why am I teaching language? Who am I teaching this language to? When my students come back and join me in these online classes, why do they care that you have a subject-object verb order? Why do they care? How do you ask somebody, what time do you wake up? So I really started grappling with these questions, and I reached out to other colleagues. I reached out to other resources that were available at that time. And I think that was the silver lining of the pandemic, in that there was a lot of online resources available at that time. So I read up on trauma-informed pedagogy that really made me think about when learners are so, not even learners and faculty, when you're all participating and you're all collectively traumatized. your learning is going to be impacted. How you engage with the material is going to be impacted. So then how do we select content that really brings learners in and also gives them the tool to grapple with these conflicts that were going on at the time. So I'll talk a little bit about the resources that I sought and how they helped me again think about it. And I have included them as a list because I would be lying if I said there was this one resource that really helped put everything into place. I've also included them and added some other things in the end of the slideshow where you have just resources where you could start also. I have selected these because these are bite-sized pieces compared to what you have in terms of literature for diversity, equity, and inclusion, because there's a lot of material and it is so easy to get overwhelmed. So it is. I have personally found it very useful to start with one and then see where that leads me to. Not everything will make sense to everybody. For instance, one of these resources where the resource by Rose, Harbour, Johnston's, and Daly is a, sorry, not the fourth resource, sorry, on this list is a very quick read that really gets people in, to think about, oh, what are the principles of inclusive teaching and some active strategies, for instance, if I just wanted to make a change right away. But if I am I'm somebody who has some background in social justice education, I might actually want to start with third, where I can look at my lesson plans and start incorporating different components of social justice education in my instruction. So depending on where people are, they might benefit from different resources listed here. I would also say ACTFL's Critical and Social Justice Approaches Special Interest Group is actually really useful because you have regular webinars that you can access that are made available for life. And you would have really the experts in social justice education in these webinars, and it's a good network, good community, especially if you are, again, a less commonly taught language. You might want to build a network. This might be a place, for instance, where you might want to seek colleagues for resources. So I wanted to also just have a central central piece of my thinking, some components of social justice education that I really try to center my education, my pedagogy on. So some of the things that are very important for my pedagogy now are materials and assessments that allow learners to challenge their previous ideas, previous misconceptions, previous untruths, and they provide learners opportunities and resources so that they can tap into their full potential. And the goal is hopefully the curriculum to empower the learners, to invite them to bring in their strengths to education and not have a deficiency-based model. What learners are lacking, you want to make them aware of their strengths, of their capabilities, and then build upon them. And something that's very critical to all of this is every engagement is hopefully an opportunity for critical thinking and agency, so that they could feel more empowered to address structural inequalities that exist outside the classroom. I will talk now about a couple of examples now in my elementary Hindi-Urdu courses. And again, I would emphasize there are many elements of curriculum design, and you could have your reflection on your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in all of these. You can think about, how is my assessment, for instance, inclusive? How are my learning activities? So are my course objectives actually inclusive? Do they recognize learner differences and things like those? What I am focusing right now on in this presentation is teaching and learning materials. So one of the first questions, and I think this is so basic, now I think it is so basic, but earlier I didn't. So one of the themes that was very important even in my earlier instruction was identity. So there would be a lot of reflections for learners on their identity. A lot of my learners in Hindi and Urdu classrooms are heritage learners that would comprise at least 85 to 90% of classrooms. And a lot of times their motivation for learning is to strengthen their cultural ties with this part of South Asia they're from. They also have a lot of dissonance within them. They're also still navigating what is their place within South Asia and then outside of South Asia. So those are questions that would inevitably be addressed in my courses. But then I also, I think in the recent years, have expanded the question, who is represented in these materials that I present. So we know from current scholarship that it is motivating for learners to see themselves reflected in their course materials. And it sends positive, powerful messages to them about what is their place in the discipline, in this case, Hindi and Urdu language learning, and in the society at large. So these are my students currently, right? Majority of them are South Asian Americans. They identify as that. Some of them have roots in Pakistan and others in India. And I think one in Bangladesh. We have these students, yet all the people that we will see in textbooks will not look anything like them. So even when you have really invested in creating high quality audiovisual materials, a lot of people that you would then see are native Hindi speakers. A lot of people that you would see would be in cities. A lot of these people that you would see would be upper caste. You would not, even in the last names, you can tell the caste. So you would see all of these, but not who comes in the classroom. You would see, for instance, images like these, but these are not in places of power. You would see people, for instance, doing artisanal work, or you might have, for instance, astrology, or you're talking about embroidery, you're talking about these traditions of silver coins. There's, of course, a conversation about culture, but that is so specific to certain jobs, but not culture as a part of daily life and how it comes up every day. So that's why I wanted to talk about, you can have really high quality materials in terms of production, but it could still be found lacking in, for instance, diversity or inclusion in this case. I'll also add that a lot of textbooks now come with audio recordings. They also reinforce native speaker bias, because you have speakers who speak a certain variety of Hindi that's a very Sanskritized variety of Hindi a lot of times. And again, we're not even talking about pace of speaking. We're just talking about the variety of Hindi that's presented. Also, these materials a lot of times emphasize Hindi-Urdu binary, that a lot of people in India will only speak Hindi versus only a lot of people in Pakistan would only speak Urdu, whereas the Hindi that is taught in a lot of these classrooms is Hindustani, which is a blend of Hindi and Urdu. It is very difficult to separate Urdu words from Hindi vocabulary when you're talking even day to day, but you would have these materials presented in these textbooks. So what I did was, I did what I thought was important at the time. So one of the questions was representation. So on the left is a speaking information gap activity, because again, I wanted more representation of women, for instance, in places other than home. So I looked for images that had women in the position of power. So you would see somebody who's a police officer, somebody who's an accomplished sports person, and not just a male sports figure. Also not just cricket. So we also wanted to provide other variety. Also, food is something that you would see, and that's why I asked you in the beginning, what is something that you associate with Indian or Pakistani food? And a lot of times the food that you would see in the restaurants, and as we see in your Zoom chat, and as we see in textbooks, it's very inspired by North Indian food. And within North Indian food, Mughlai food, so that would be Delhi, Punjab focused. The one on the right, I tried to incorporate people who could look like my students. So you don't only have people who are Caucasian or people who are just South Asian. I wanted to address, like having different kinds of hair color, different kinds of sizes, shapes, having a beard, not having a beard, even textures of hair. I just wanted to normalize different kind of people in worksheets, not just a certain South Asian that we are presenting. I'll also add the decision to include disabilities, physical disabilities, was also very intentional, because a lot of times and these are just physical disabilities, this is not even intellectual disabilities. A lot of textbooks, for instance, that I've seen, I've never, in any of the Hindi-Urdu textbooks, I've not seen anybody with a physical disability, as if we live in a world where there are none. So I also just wanted to bring in people that I would see on a campus. And again, not make a big deal out of it, just normalize having these images, because this is who we are surrounded by. This is who we are. The other thing I wanted to emphasize was to provide multiple models of proficient Hindi-Urdu speakers. So not just a native Hindi speaker. So these three people that I have, one of them is a former Hindi-Urdu student. I know Fatima would recognize, because she also is a Rice student. And these are materials created.
A German student.
And these are materials created with the permission, with the students' permission, where I reached out to students and basically wanted to enrich the authentic data that I have for students. So when students are talking about their bios, I wanted them to be able to see somebody who is actually from Dominican Republic, raised in the US, speaks Hindi, speaks German, and speaks other languages. This is somebody who was raised in India, but he is from a caste that would not be considered a higher caste. It's a Jadav caste. So that is a lower caste in India. And then I have somebody who is a heritage language learner here, who was a heritage language learner and sounds like a heritage language learner, does not sound like a typical native Hindi speaker that's presented in the textbooks. Because a lot of times students would make statements like, we can never sound like that, but that's not the goal. The goal is for you to sound like you and communicate meaning. So it is my hope that by using these materials, learners can be inspired to expand their ideas, revise their notions of who they need to be in order to be considered proficient in Hindi. Also, there is a lot of, again, like I said, identity is a key part of my instruction. So there, in the first semester itself, you do a grammatical structure that allows you to talk about facts, routines. In the past, they would all be about routines. All the textbooks would be about what time do you wake up, what time do you sleep, what do you eat for breakfast, right? So everybody knows about everybody's routines. But I also realized we can also use these to talk about stereotypes, because they are also facts, right? So I can say this person is XYZ. That's a statement of fact, and that can be represented by that grammatical structure. So students are encouraged to then investigate about desis in the US. Does anybody have any guess about what the stereotypes could be? I would not be offended if you look at the images.
Maybe the critical mother, the first one.
Uh-huh.
And it's a great Netflix show, by the way.
Any other guesses? I'm unable to see the chat, so you might have to unmute yourself and yell out.
Like, is it kind of like this, like, oh gosh, I could be totally wrong, like this kind of guru or spiritual looking person, and how that's often associated with, I guess, Indian culture?
Yeah. Yes, so you are both correct. The first one, the stereotype is that a lot of Desi parents are very strict, are very critical of you. And the second was all Indians are Hindus, which is also something that's presented in these shows, right? So these are the stereotypes that we look at about Desis in the US. But I have also found it is easy to talk about the other, but not look within. So we then also talk about what are the stereotypes, for instance, that exist within Desis in South Asia. So these are some examples about these stereotypes about Sikh and Gujaratis that exist within South Asia also. So the reason for doing these is also, we talk about building intercultural knowledge, we talk about building cultural knowledge, but never really use our curriculum to talk about those. A lot of times this conversation about let's talk about culture and then let's talk about language separated, but you could have opportunities where you could bring both of these together without sacrificing one for the other. Also, we investigate, again, this is first semester of Hindi, doing this in Hindi for the most part, where we also question, oh, so who are Desis? Who is considered Desi also? So you have these questions that students grapple with in the first semester of Hindi itself. The second that I have been working on in the past year is making caste more visible. And one of the things that caste has been invisible, not just from instruction in Hindi-Urdu classrooms or South Asian language classrooms, but also from media in South Asia. Generally, whether you would bring that to your language classrooms or even culture courses, for instance, that I teach, or even when you talk about math, engineering, other disciplines, caste is invisible. You can talk about caste as intellectually, maybe in a sociology class, but do you talk about class? Do you engage with caste as it exists on a daily basis? So that is something that I've been trying to do more in my language classrooms now, because again, I am thinking about who are the students who are learning and what are they learning about. So caste in Hindi-Urdu classrooms is generally an occasion. So you talk about caste, that this is the week that we will talk about caste in South Asia, or talk about caste in India. So for instance, these are lesson plans from NYU's website on Dalits. The other is abolishing the caste system. And again, I can allow you to read a little bit about the objectives of these units. These are directed towards advanced learners. Again, so they are intermediate or high advanced low proficiency. And over 3 sessions, students will be able to describe the caste system, the nuances, the comparisons of different caste systems, and focus on literature, right? Similarly, this is another lesson that talks about the history, that talks about the linguistic features. And I want to say, I am okay with instructors doing that. I'm okay with instructors providing material to students to learn about the history of caste, to talk about how caste manifests in literature. But I think what I am concerned with, and have been only recently, because again, in the absence of better guidance, I would say, more interactions with my colleagues, I looked up to these materials that were available, that were developed by people who are experts in Hindi-Urdu language instruction. So I aspired to do these things, but I also felt a dissonance within me, because it felt strange to talk about caste, way to talk about caste until the 3rd year of Hindi, and also act like it doesn't exist in daily life. I also want to acknowledge that I am speaking all of this as somebody who is a Hindu woman belonging to an upper caste, who is belonging to an urban area, an affluent family. So I am making these statements with the knowledge that I am that, but I also know that my students have questions about caste. They have questions about caste in the first semester, and I try to have those questions addressed in the first semester. So first semester, one of the things that we again talk about is pronunciation, right? We talk about identity. And that is such a good opportunity to talk about how your pronunciation is tied to your identity, right? How pronunciation of a South Asian name by a South Asian in America is sometimes laughed about. So when I say my name is Divya, that's the Hindi pronunciation, but I say my name is Divya, that's not the Hindi pronunciation. And I might be mocked by other South Asians who think that there's one correct way to talk, to say a South Asian name, right? So you already grapple with these questions. So then if you're talking about names are a big clue in South Asia, in Hinduism, to identify your caste, to mark your identity. If I hear somebody's full name, I would know, one, their gender, at least the biological gender, and the region that they're from, maybe from the north or the south. I can talk about their caste, have a fairly good idea about the caste. So if my learners know this, they can bring this, they can reference this when they're doing role plays. So for instance, we make the issue of name relevant when we have students greet somebody with a secular greeting, when they identify as Hindu and somebody else is a Muslim, they use adab. Versus if both of them are Muslim from Pakistan, for instance, they use a different greeting, which is salam alaikum wa alaikum assalam. So when we are doing this for greetings, why don't we again talk about this, make it relevant for caste in the first semester itself? The other thing now that I want to now ask about, which is also related to discussion of caste, is since you have already informed me your familiarity with certain Indian dishes, I'm going to present names of 3 dishes, and I'm going to ask which of these is not an Indian food dish. Okay, so type your answer 1, 2, or 3, and do not hit enter. Okay. So red ant chutney, elephant rice, goat blood fry, fried lotus stem. Which of these is not Indian food? Type, but don't hit yet hit enter.
Can I call a friend?
Is your friend Divya? You can call a friend who is not Divya or Google. Yes. Okay. So once you are ready, hit enter. I'm again going to stop share just so that I can see everybody's responses. Okay. On a countdown, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we have 2, 1, 4, 3, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 2. Okay, so I see a lot of 3s. I see some 2s. Yes, mostly 3s and 4s, some 2s. Okay, so let's find out. I don't know, when did this become a trivia quiz on Indian food? Okay. So the correct answer, so a lot of people said 3, some said 2, some said 4. The answer is 2. So red ant chutney, goat blood fry, and fried lotus stem are all Indian foods. Good job.
I didn't win.
Yes, you win. Yes, you get extra 5 minutes with me after this. All right. So red ant chutney, and goat blood fry are actually Indian dishes, but you would never see them in popular media. You would never see them referenced. They are largely invisible, and they're also largely invisible because they are also part of what's considered Dalit food, right? So you would, for instance, on the right is example of a dish of the dish made of goat blood, because Dalits who were not provided the same resources as higher casted, so they had to make do with the food that they had available. And one of them was beef, for instance, or you had blood in this case, right, or ant in the other case. And you, for instance, in this case, you saute that with all spices that you have and eat it as a side of rice. Right? So you have food that is Indian food, but it is not visible. It is only, for instance, recently in a movie a couple of years, Newton, that was nominated for Oscars, that you had the first reference of red ant chutney in a Bollywood film. And even then, the protagonist did not know what that was. So then in my food unit, and I said food unit 3.0, because this is the third iteration of like me revising things. So for instance, these are elementary 2 students. So students who now would be, for instance, in the spring semester. They have some now proficiency in Hindi, and the focus is narrative past tense. And students do 2 things. One is they research and reflect on what is authentic Desi cuisine in the food unit, because that builds their food vocabulary. So they look at a restaurant menu in India and in the US, and basically try to identify what is authentic Indian food served in an authentic Indian restaurant. What counts as Desi? They also investigate what is curry. Again, that's a question that a lot of freshmen, sophomore, juniors, they do not, even seniors, they do not have a clear understanding of what curry is. And they have these questions. And not everybody takes a course in, for instance, takes culture courses to be able to learn about these. So, but language course, again, language doesn't have to be, let's just make our favorite recipe. Language courses can be opportunities for rich discussions, can be opportunities for cultural learning. The other part, so that was what I used to do. And then once I started incorporating more discussion of caste in my courses, I wanted them to talk about food and memory. So food experiences that are personally significant for them. And talking about how when you erase food, you also erase a culture's, a community's culture, their identity. So they then actually translate Dalit recipes in English from blogs to then Hindi recipes. They're also free. For instance, a student in the past has tried to recreate a Dalit recipe on campus. But it has also been done with a lot of caution, because this is not, and we want to acknowledge that this is not an experience. This is somebody's livelihood. This was a decision not made in privilege. This was a decision that was forced upon them. And a lot of these things that, for instance, millet as a grain, a lot of these things that become glorified later because they're health foods, etc., when they were not in the first place part of a glorification or celebration, students do that with that awareness as even as they present them. But one of the goals has been to again normalize, not normalize, to make visible a lot of missing narratives in my courses. So I wanted to just finish with that creating these materials is a lot of work. And I would emphasize, especially for less commonly taught languages, because you might have less resources to work with. You might already have some constraints that we established in the beginning. Not to say that other language programs won't have those, but these might be heightened for those in less commonly taught languages. I would also add having a collaborator is useful, especially in recognizing your blind spots, because again, others' perspectives does help improve your course material, and you do not have to make all the changes at once. You could do it one thing at a moment, and again, like I did in the beginning, what is something that I could do already? And that really helped build my confidence, because I knew I was on the path to making changes. And yeah, the work is never done. I have included some resources. I've added them a little. I have added a couple of new ones from the ones that I shared earlier. So there's also a reading list that I compiled for pedagogy, and these include lesson plans, podcasts, so different formats, and also a journal dimension from Scald that has a lot of lessons plans, etc. also. So I'll actually end here because these discussions to be had are also very scary. I sometimes, for instance, do not know how the discussion would end or what shape it would take. So it is a reminder to students and myself also that this is going to be a brave space, not necessarily a safe space. And we are going to address what comes up in ways that are respectful and hopefully grow from these and be willing to make changes. So I'll end here.
Thank you, Divya, for accepting the invitation, for sharing your journey. It's really brave of you. There's a couple of words that come to mind as I was listening to you. Intellectual humility, knowing that even if we're educators, we need to always be humble and know that we need to stop learning. And it's hard to feel like we're showing the ugly parts of our culture. I always struggle with that, right? I want everyone to love my culture. So it's very brave of you to do that. So we have a few minutes for questions. You can just unmute yourself. If you don't feel comfortable unmuting yourself, you can put the question in the chat. So yeah, we have about like 9 minutes, so we do have some time.
Yes, Luhan.
You might know where I'm coming from. So I was really, I think it was really interesting and also really brave, as Luciris was saying. I do this because she's in this part of my screen. Maybe she's not here. About showing the part that might be more problematic or not more easy digesting of a culture. And I saw that you brought the concept and the question of caste and how it's sometimes, if at all, touched upon on more advanced levels. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on trying to incorporate that from day one? Is there something like linguistically that they can, because you said something in the picture, you say, oh, you see in the last names, you see the caste, and I was like, what?
Yeah. So I don't do it on the first day because I think I also
Sorry, first levels, not first day, poor kids.
first levels, yes. So yes, so from the first levels, when we're talking about pronunciation, and that leads to the topic of identity. So once students can talk about how their pronunciation is tied to their identity, then we'll look at names, because I found it useful for learners to first think about themselves, reflect on how certain experiences are meaningful to them, and then make it bigger and make them look at the other, because they already had the experience, oh, that this matters, that how I am seen matters. So that's why I also do the same thing with Desi stereotypes, right? So Desi stereotypes about them in the US. So they can talk about how that might be demeaning for them, and that might be reductive. So they identify what stereotypes do to people, and then have them think about, oh, but actually I might also do that to another community. So that's the approach that I generally follow. So we do that in the first semester itself, talking about caste and last names. Yeah. Even stereotypes that we are doing right now is part of the first semester right now. So again, doing caste at that time. Yeah.
It's one of the principles of intercultural communication that I know you know of, like look at yourself before looking at others. I don't know if you're familiar with intercultural communication.
Yeah. It sounds vaguely familiar. I don't know. Is ICC? I don't know. DC? Is it
ICC, Arizona, ICC.
Oh my God, y'all need to stop. Asia has a question.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm just kind of sorry, wondering if you ever do any sort of comparison between like looking at the caste system and looking, I guess, comparing it to like social inequality in the United States as well. That is just, I'm just curious. And
Yeah,
I think often like in the United, I'm talking about a dominant society of the United States too, just like, I think often people like learn about the caste system and they're like, oh my God, that's horrible. And it's like, is it that different in a country like the United States, It's just
69 next semester.
yeah. So I'll be honest, I think I don't feel personally comfortable introducing the topic of race as long as I don't educate myself enough about this. I think I'm still educating myself. But I do pose this question, if this is a phenomena, this social stratification limited only to India or Hinduism. And that leads students to talk about, for instance, how this might exist in another religion. So how it might exist in Islam, how it might exist in Pakistan and in the US also. So students talk about race. It has been my experience that students in these classes, in Hindi-Urdu classes especially, they want to talk about race, they want to talk about caste, but they don't have the opportunities because again, it has been my experience and students have shared with me that they don't know the vocabulary to talk about this with their families, for instance, a lot of times, or even back home. They might not have the resources. So these classes become an opportunity to talk about race in the US, and that this judgment of how caste is such an old primitive system of discrimination that is so disrespectful of human dignity is not a system that's unique only to India or Hinduism. So that definitely comes up, but I do not intentionally teach. Like I do not create, for instance, worksheets on race, but I like to guide the discussion in that direction where it would come up and it would invite other forms of discrimination in other societies also. Yeah.
As we wrap up, Divya, I wish we had 2 hours with you. Honestly, I'm gonna take advantage of my moderator position and ask you to share. Were there moments where this journey was uncomfortable for you, and how did you confront that?
That's a great question. I think every time I introduce this topic is uncomfortable. I remember, I think, and there's some moments where I'm immediately not able to respond. So for instance, when I did the similar question, where I asked you, the poll, which of these is not an Indian dish? And I did this in another classroom, which had a majority of Caucasian students, actually. And I did this exercise with them, and one of the students yelled, "Who eats coagulated blood? Who does that? That is so disgusting." And they talked about that before I shared the poll results. After they were done, I shared the poll results, and so blood was one of these Indian food dishes. And I had to take a moment to say, well, we might think the certain food that does not look like food here in the US, or food as we speak conventionally, but it could be food in other parts of the world. And we might want to lean closer into why that is a particular food choice. But again, that is something I'm always nervous about, how it might be received, again, these are risky conversations in that sense, because you do not know what direction they might take. You do not know if you'll be equipped in that moment to respond appropriately. So I'm always concerned about those. But I think I've also found, even if in that moment I'm not able to respond, I go back and say, I don't think it was a complete response. I still have additional thoughts. I think that has helped, and a lot of students, mostly students, have appreciated that. But I never know what that would lead to. Yeah.
Well, I mean, with that beautiful testimony and that wonderful presentation, I want to thank you for saying yes to our invitation. Yes, Fatima and I were talking about this. We were saying, we're going to tell her that we miss her. So thank you so much, Divya, for closing out our pedagogical
I didn't get the memo.
I know, sorry. So thank you so much for closing our pedagogical forum. I really hope that this effort to have representation for less commonly taught languages is, not hope, I know that it's useful for our colleagues who are teaching less commonly taught languages right now. I will share the recording online. And Divya, if you don't mind, I'll ask you for the slides. That way folks can have access to the resources. And yeah, we miss you, Divya. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you.
Thank you, Divya. We miss you a lot. A lot.
You too, Kevin. Kevincito.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Have a good afternoon.
Bye. Thank you, guys.
Thank y'all. Bye.